Hello viewers, I'm Daniel Kasahon with ETV Language. In this edition, we discuss the reform process happening in Ethiopia with Dr. Awol, who is a prominent analyst in the local and international media outlets on various issues. Welcome to the studio, Dr. Awol.
Thank you for having me.
In your view, what are the fundamental changes, the successes you observed in the reform process in this country?
I think there are a huge range of impressive reforms that have taken place in this country over the course of the last 1 year. The first and the most important is the widening of the political space. The fact that people are a lot more freer today to speak and express their views on a range of policy issues. The fact that the media is free to report and inform the public. The fact that opposition political parties can now organize themselves and mobilize their constituencies. And I think that's one of the real change that we see on the ground, that all of us benefited actually from that opening. There are impressive progress being made, I think, on the economic side. Some of these changes that are put into place would take time to actually trickle down and have impact on people's lives, but at the macroeconomic level, I think there are some impressive movements that are being made. In terms of regional peace and security and economic prosperity at the regional level, there are work that is being done. I think, generally speaking, the changes that have been implemented over the course of the last 1 year are really fundamental, in the sense that if we are to continue with this change, with the kind of speed and force that we have done it over the course of the last 1 year, I think Ethiopia stands a very good chance of transitioning.
But the reform has been moving on rough roads. There were many ups and downs. It has experienced lots of ups and downs. From where do you think that these hurdles emerged?
Absolutely. So when you engage in political transition in a highly divided country like Ethiopia, a country that has never experienced democracy as a culture and as a tradition, where institutions have always been controlled by the government and served the interests of the ruling regimes, of course we are going to experience significant hurdles in terms of moving from that authoritarian system into a democratic system. Democracy is a culture. It's an institutional culture. It's a public culture. Inculcating democratic culture, changing people's ways of thinking, people's perceptions, our mindset, takes a very long time. So the hurdles that we see on the ground now are partly the result of that culture, which lacks democratic accountability, in the sense that we seem to know that we are entitled to do certain things, so we don't really understand that there is a limit. Right? Democracy gives you right, but also imposes a limit on you. So that is one, I think, source of some of the problems that we see. The other problem is far more deeper, and it is structural, in the sense that this is a country of nations and nationalities that has been held together by force for a very long period of time. There is no consensus on the identity of the Ethiopian state, on what the different actors want. There are significant differences. That's why you have these fault lines drawn across ethnic lines in various places. And you have various political actors that are operating on these fault lines to galvanize support, but also to mobilize their constituencies. So when you try to move from this highly divided place into a common kind of place where you have to create a new vision for the country, you are bound to have this kind of conflicts and displacements of people that we see on the ground. I think you can attribute this to a number of other factors as well. The fact that, for example, the government is a little bit reluctant in terms of enforcing law and order. There might be a good reason for doing that, but what is the threshold? What are the kinds of things that has to be tolerated by the state by way of encouraging people to exercise freedom of expression, but making sure that your exercise of freedom of expression doesn't go beyond the exercise of right and infringing upon the freedoms of other people. So there's a problem in terms of getting that balance right. And I think one of the reasons why this is happening is because the state is becoming weaker and weaker. The state that used to rely on violence and force suddenly shifted its position, and the public at the same time began to make demands of all sorts. So you have this imbalance between declining power of state, increasing demands of the people to participate in politics. So you have this imbalance, and you have obviously those kind of deeper contradictions in the state that has been around for a very long time. It's a combination of all of this that is making it difficult. And I think that Ethiopia is not an exception. Ethiopia is unique in the sense that I think the diversity in the country, the historical kind of difference between the different groups and the various interests makes it very difficult. I think the transition would be rough, but transitions are always very difficult. They're not, it's not straightforward. You will face obstacles. Sometimes there is a slide back.
Almost a year ago, you said, I quote, the most urgent and immediate task for the new Prime Minister would be to set out a new vision for the country. What were your expectations as a new vision?
So by a new vision, I have in mind, for example, what is the kind of country that we want going forward. There is a particular idea of what we are as a society, held by certain groups. There are other groups who have an entirely different view of what this country should be, or where this country should be heading. So, for example, currently we have a federal arrangement, right? Various nations and nationalities in this country have their own government structure at the state level. They are entitled to a range of rights at the regional level, but at the federal level, they are entitled to rule the broader Ethiopian states through shared rule. And this is a system that is contested by certain segments of Ethiopian society. And this is, I think, one of the most significant debates that we are having. So I think the government needs to set out its vision of what it wants to see going forward. What kind of country are we envisioning going forward? Are we envisioning a multinational federal state that kind of builds on what we have now and improves and strengthens this current arrangement, or are we moving away from the current arrangement into something else? It's important that we have clarity from the government. Once we have a clear position from the government, then you can mobilize other forces. You can have a conversation, critical debates around those visions. And I think it's not solely the responsibility of the government to set out that vision. Other political actors also have the responsibility to say what their vision of the Ethiopian state is and why that is a good thing and how that benefits the various groups who live in this country.
Were you expecting policy frameworks to anchor the reform?
Of course, you have to have a very clear, well thought out policy to serve as an anchor for that vision. A vision in of itself cannot be translated into meaningful practical steps that can actually change things through institutions and through various sectors in society. So if you have a vision, that vision has to be implemented through laws, policies, and regulations of the state, yes.
How do you think that the aspired reform in this country can be deep-rooted?
I think it is very difficult to reform any country for that reason, but I think reforming the Ethiopian state is even more difficult. Ethiopia is a state that has a very strong tradition as a state compared to, for example, other African countries. Most other African countries are young and they don't really have the tradition of statehood as we do in this country. People respect authority to some level, although there are things that are changing now because of new media and so on and so forth, and the emergence of various actors with significant following. Traditionally, the Ethiopian society respects authority. The tradition of state is there. But the fact that there is a tradition doesn't mean that makes reform possible. In fact, it actually makes it very difficult because there is a very particular way of thinking about all sorts of things, about how, for example, the Ethiopian state should be envisioned, how institutions should be structured, our conception of, for example, how languages should be used, how different cultures should be respected and given recognition. On a range of issues, there are significant views. And these are deeply political, So reforming this is going to be very difficult. But I think as a government, what you need to do is set out that vision, try to galvanize support for that vision, create understanding and a consensus around that vision. Obviously, you would expect the government to hold elections. Once we have election and a government is elected by a majority, you expect that government to implement that policy that has a broader support within government. So there has to be a certain level of authority that is used to implement that vision, but there has to be consensus as well around that vision.
Recently, PRDF has held a session, maybe 11th session, and it has participated the sister parties. And this is said exceptional from the past EPRDF sessions. What do you comment on this, giving them the chance to participate and to deal with pressing issues of this country?
So I think, at the moment, EPRDF appears to be the only party that has relative coherence compared to the opposition parties. And obviously, it has to have some level of coherence as a ruling party. But EPRDF's own coherence and cohesion has been experiencing significant problems over the course of the last 2-3 years. This began right after the days of the former Prime Minister Malal Zenawi. When Haile Mariam came into power, he didn't really have the kind of authority and command that his predecessor had, and therefore other coalition members began to assert themselves. And it is really that process that kind of resulted into the protest movement and then the fractious relations within the ruling party itself and this change that we saw. And since the appointment of the new Prime Minister, Abiy Ahmed, EPRDF continued to have difficulties in terms of coming together around a single idea. And you see public statements, for example, disagreeing with the leadership of the party, and sometimes some regions openly stating that they don't agree with laws that are passed by Parliament. In my view, this is not necessarily a bad thing. We actually need political parties that disagree with one another, political parties who could publicly speak out when they have reservations about policies of the government. This is a good thing for me. But the problem is, if we don't have the culture that disagrees without being disagreeable, right? Without threatening the fundamental structures of the state, because one way or another, I think currently a lot depends on whether EPRDF can get actors together and take this country forward. So the only concern I have in terms of that disagreement within the party is their ability to disagree without being disagreeable, without basically leading to some kind of fracture. And I think that may be a risk that I see. There's also been talks of, for example, bringing in what are called agar partner institutions. And I
call
think
them sister parties?
They refer to them sister parties as well, yes. I think it's important to bring those on the periphery into the center. There has been talks of allowing them to join EPRDF. There have also been talks of merging EPRDF itself into a single party rather than a coalition of different fronts. I think there are discussions that is going on in terms of how to bring EPRDF parties together as a single party, but at the same time allow these other sister parties to come and join EPRDF. I think that requires a lot of details to be ironed out, and the kind of structure and form that a new party needs to take, and I don't think there is an agreement on that. And the fact that we see, for example, difference of views on policies and ideologies also contributes to that debate as to how EPRDF moves forward, on what ideology, on what vision for the country. There are significant differences around this.
Yeah, EPRDF is also trying to join other parties, even from the opposition, and to form a unified party. How do you find this move? Is it healthy and will it be productive?
Are you referring to, for example, member parties of EPRDF trying to merge with other parties at the regional level?
Yes, including OLF, for instance, and other Gumbo 7, they have signed agreements
with the government to become one
Yeah.
party. I'm actually not aware of
They're going
the
to
ruling
form
party.
from 107 parties to
Yeah, so
a
there has
party
been.
with a few figures.
Yeah. I think there is a desire on the part both of the opposition and the government, the ruling party, to narrow down or reduce the number of parties in the political landscape. You have 100 plus political parties.
Yeah.
It's almost impossible to have a meaningful conversation and debate about the future of this country and the ways in which this transition should go forward with 100 plus different political parties with different visions and views on all sorts of things. So I think it is reasonable for the ruling party and other parties to work together to make sure that we have fewer actors, few organized political parties, so that we know who they are, we know what they stand for. If that couldn't happen, I think it makes it very difficult for the country to kind of properly follow and understand what every political party stands for. But I'm not sure actually that EPRDF could unite, for example, with OLF or with Gimbot 7. Those are kind of stronger, highly well-known political organizations in the country. So you would expect those to continue to be opposition parties and independent parties. If OLF and Gimbot 7 were to join EPRDF, one, I don't see how that's possible because there's significant ideological difference between those parties. And secondly, we would not have any opposition. Okay. So we have to have opposition, but we don't need 100 plus opposition because it just makes politics meaningless.
That's right. Election is going to happen in this country in the coming year. Do you expect that Dr. Abiy Ahmed will have the potential, the possibility to get at least one term?
I believe so. I mean, if, given what we know now, I can't tell you what would happen, for example, in the next 5-6 months. But given what we know now, I think the only political party that seems to have a certain level of coherence and maturity, experience of governing, and also structure as a party within various regions is EPRDF. The other political parties, obviously they have been persecuted, they have been chased out of the country by the previous government. They are only coming back. They have not even properly established their own institution. They have not established offices in various parts of the country, which makes political mobilization very difficult. So based on, I think, what we know now and what we see in terms of the capacity of these parties, yes, EPRDF have a very good chance of winning the next election. But again, this is very conjectural. It depends on a number of events that would happen or that we will see in the political scene over the course of the next 7-8 months.
What do you foresee in the future of this reform happening in this country? Will it be stronger?
I think it's important to be optimistic because there are very good reasons to be optimistic. But at the same time, I think we have to be very cautious in terms of what we expect of this reform. I think the reform in this country went very fast at the beginning. And the fact that it moved very fast, the political process opened up too quickly and in a way that made controlling the system, controlling the political space very difficult. I think incremental change is actually a lot more productive, in my view, than the kind of opening that we saw in the political process, and which also led to a significant level of disruptions and displacement of millions of people and violence in various parts of the country. And I think, partly why we had those problems is because the political process was opened up very quickly. And now, we have seen, for example, moments where the government has to respond forcefully. If the process was opened up somewhat a lot more cautiously having placed some key kind of important strategies in place, then there would have been an opportunity, I think, to reduce those significant security gaps that we have seen. I'm still optimistic that we will be able to move forward, but I think it's important to acknowledge and recognize that this is a country that is so divided, with political actors who have radically different views about some basic ideas of the state. Unless we form a common view on these basic ideas, unless we act with some due diligence, with responsibility to resolve those differences, I think we are going to experience some problem. And it's possible that the very government that is trying to take the country forward might be forced to go back, right, to kind of slide it back into the kind of systems and repressive practices that we had in the past. That might become impossible. So it is, I think, everybody's responsibility, the responsibility of all political actors and all stakeholders, to make sure that we act responsibly towards one another, but at the same time expect the government to respect those key principles set out in the Constitution when individuals and actors transgress their rights and create chaos and violence in the country. We expect the government to protect the population. So if we act cautiously, if we move forward responsibly, I think we have a very good chance. But the contradictions that the country has to engage with is so deep, so widespread, that it is very difficult to see a very smooth pathway to democratization in Ethiopia. I think, in my view, if we are actually able to sustain the level of freedom that we have now, it's a good thing. We expect the government to take us forward, but I think it's also important to sustain and preserve the level of freedom that we are enjoying now.
Okay. After the Prime Minister recently held a round table under the theme Ethiopia in the wake of political reforms, thus to review 30 chapter entries for a book project set to examine the past 1 year by academics and thematic experts. You have taken part in the event.
Yes.
What has the session produced?
So this is a book project that was intended to bring together some perspectives on what has been done by the Prime Minister over the course of the last 1 year. These are not intended to be simply descriptive accounts of what happened, but also evaluative accounts. So I participated as a moderator, and I moderated 2 panels on political reforms. So those were, for example, papers that looked into political tradition from a historical perspective and also from a conceptual perspective. What are some of the key challenges that countries going through political transition experience normally, and what is so unique about Ethiopia, and what are the contradictions in Ethiopia, and what are the prospects, what are some of the enabling factors and the disabling factors, and what can be done about those things. There were papers on transitional justice, for example. So every authoritarian government leaves behind a legacy of violence and human rights violations and so on and so forth. So the question is, how do you deal with that horrific past if you are to move forward, right? In political transition, you can't simply forget everything that happened in the past and move forward, because people want justice. Political transition itself requires reconciliation, both as a process and as an outcome, and the government has to reckon in some ways with that violent past. So there were papers that dealt with those problems, including a paper that engaged with the Peace and Reconciliation Commission established by the Prime Minister. So there are a range of papers, including on foreign relations, national security, and other areas. I think this is a very good way, I think also a very good culture by the government to allow and invite academics to examine critically what the government has done over the course of the last year and propose ways forward, and the government can learn from that. And I think it's an excellent exercise that kind of enriched some of the debates and the discussions around political transition, some of the kind of key thematic issues within that broader topic of political transition.
We are told that the book is going to be printed in English, but the national language is Amharic. Why? Why not Amharic first?
That's a very good question. So I'm not involved in the design of the project. I was actually simply invited as a moderator to moderate a couple of panels. So I wasn't part of that discussion. But the fact of the matter is that most knowledge today about the states, about political transition, about economic progress, foreign relations, national security, those knowledges are produced in English. I think most people who are engaged in research, in academia, policy work, these are done in English at the conceptual level. So it's not a bad thing to have that undertaken in English, but I think there's a very good case to be made that maybe a parallel work in Amharic may be, I think, important, or even in other languages, such as in Afan Oromo, may be important, or maybe this very book could be made available in both Amharic and Afan Oromo or other languages too. But I think there is a limit in terms of how much you can actually do in Ethiopian languages because of the ways in which the language industry, the knowledge industry around the world is structured, which is mainly in English.
Thank you very much, Dr. Awol, for your time and candid explanations.
Thanks for having me.
Well, dear viewers, that wraps up the program in this edition. See you next time with yet another edition of the program on ETV language. Thank you for choosing and watching us.